I must ask, Mr. Secretary, have you been contacted by the Biden administration about service there, as we've seen from Vice President Kerry?
I have a lot of friends who are going to be in the new administration from the top through the leadership levels. I'm happy to offer my advice whenever asked, and will continue to do so.
Let us speak of stimulus, Jack Lew, as we can. In the Friedman article in the New York Times, the president-elect makes clear he's willing to compromise with McConnell. He does not want to embarrass McConnell. What is the common ground that they can find quickly on stimulus?
Tom, the common ground has been clear for a very long time. And finally, in the last, we've seen a conversation beginning looking to find it. Since the expiration of extended and supplemental unemployment benefits, since the expiration of protections on eviction, we've seen a train coming right at us. And it's been far too long since Congress has had a serious conversation. The House passed legislation in May, and we've seen virtually nothing since then. Let's just remember what the facts are. And Chairman Powell described it so well in those opening comments. With nearly 10 million people unemployed, and a large fraction of them, 5 to 10 million people facing eviction, the degree of crisis here is not small. It's very large. It's large in macro terms, and it's just enormous in terms of personal terms. If people lose their homes, if people are homeless at the end of this crisis, their recovery period will not be months. It will be very long, and it will be very hard. That is going to be a social problem and an economic problem. So Congress has to deal now, before the inauguration, with the multiple challenges of keeping people in their homes with eviction protection, giving them support to pay mortgages and rent, helping keep food on the table through a combination of unemployment benefits and food assistance, and dealing with the problems at state and local government, which are going to mean a cutback in services and a loss of employment at the worst time. We went through the last high point of the COVID crisis, the low point of the economy, with enormous government support. That's over. So if we go through the long, hard winter that we see ahead without additional support, it's a long time before January, February.
Mr. Secretary, how do we span the great distrust of the rural-urban divide in this nation? You have tackled that for years, again, going back to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts ages ago. There's just an immense distrust of those cities and those Democrats. It's right out of the 19th century. How do we break that distrust and come to meaningful compromise?
It's a good question, Tom. And, you know, it used to be that food assistance was one of the areas that brought people together. You know, the original food stamp program was a compromise between the agricultural community and people advocating on behalf of poor people. You know, we could see something like that again. The truth of the matter is, working people, regardless of whether they live in cities or in rural areas, face common challenges. You look at the team that President-elect Biden has put together, it's a group of people who focus on what does it take to make work produce a decent standard of living for people, regardless of where they live. Starting with Janet Yellen and her deputy, Wally Adeyemo, the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, Cecilia Rouse, the head of the Office of Management and Budget, Neera Tanden. These are all people who understand the problems that working people face, whether they're in cities or in rural areas. I hope we can begin that conversation, that their life experiences help them to connect with people both in the communities where people like you and I live, and in rural areas where the problems are not as different as they seem.
But Jack Lew, going back to the stimulus, and good morning to you, are you worried that Republicans are rediscovering their traditional concerns over debt and thus won't do enough on stimulus?
So, Francine, you know, I've spent most of my career trying to strike the right balance between government having the resources to do what it needs in a fiscally responsible way to make this a better country, and at times of crisis, saying we need to do what it takes to get through the crisis. This is a moment of crisis. This is a time when we should not be worrying about $100 billion here or 100 there. My own view is the bigger the better, but big is better than nothing. So I'm glad there's a conversation going on. The content of it matters. The fact that they're now talking about targeting money along the lines of the bipartisan compromise of where it's most needed and not in the places that are inefficient. That makes it possible to have a very effective package at a size that's somewhat smaller. But this is not the moment to be worrying about the deficit. That moment will come. It came and passed when the tax bill was enacted a couple of years ago, when it was almost $2 trillion for, in my view, very inefficient and unfair tax policies that added $2 trillion to the debt in a period of growth. We're in the worst economic period in my lifetime, and this is the moment to use fiscal resources. So I would go bigger now rather than smaller. And when the crisis is over, talk in a reasonable way about how to get back to a sustainable path. And I just want to be clear, the crisis being over is when most of those 10 million people are getting back to work and the unemployment rate is starting to look the way it did before COVID.
But do you think in your eyes that they're worried about debt, which in your eyes you think is wrong, or do they not want to give a win for the Democrats?
Oh, there's certainly politics going on with the Georgia elections in January. Frankly, it could cut both ways. You know, it's hard for me to understand how it helps somebody running in an election now to say to people who are scared that they're going to lose their homes, we're not willing to do anything for you. So I don't fully understand the politics, but obviously it is a factor. In terms of the economy and the impact of debt on the economy, the total debt stock is growing. It's larger now than it's been since World War II. It's also the worst economic crisis we've had since then. And the reality is, this is not the moment to worry. The time to worry is when we get through this crisis. I don't think Chairman Powell would be talking about the need for fiscal stimulus the way he has been, even the way he did yesterday, if it was not a question that people responsible for economic stewardship on both sides who are taking what I think is a reasonable view are thinking. That doesn't mean there's not a serious issue in terms of not having sufficient revenue to meet the spending requirements that our country needs, and in some cases, not taking a hard enough view on some of the spending issues.
Jack Lew, I want to go searching for the middle. Some would suggest that the president-elect, with his August age, is the last of a generation. You were weaned by Joe Moakley, who was an on-the-ground South Boston down to Brockton congressman. How do we find the Moakley middle, whether Democrat or Republican?
Look, you know, I came to Washington in the 1970s, and it feels like centuries ago. But I just want to remind everyone that the 1980s and the 1990s were considered the most partisan era that we'd ever gone through. Going a little beyond the years when I worked for Congressman Moakley, the years I worked for Speaker O'Neill, the battles in 1980 to 82 between O'Neill and Reagan were considered hyper-partisan. What happened in 1982 was a congressional election that divided government, that told both men that the only way to make progress is to do it together. I want to be clear. Speaker O'Neill did not obstruct President Reagan. He lost in the votes. That's a big difference. Mitch McConnell is obstructing votes. If Mitch McConnell would allow a majority to vote, we could actually see bipartisan action on stimulus, on issues like immigration. So the challenge here is to get back to a tradition that bipartisan majorities have to act, not running the House and the Senate as a machine to produce primary safety in one or another party and to secure a majority at the cost of functioning government. Gridlock will hurt our country if that's where we go again. And I think that President-elect Biden knows how to compromise. He knows how to do it in an honorable way for both sides. And Mitch McConnell knows how to do that also if he decides it's in his interest. I dearly hope that he decides it's in his interest. I don't think he wants to be remembered in his final years as majority leader, or I hope minority leader, as being an obstructionist. This country voted for people to work together, and Congress needs to let that happen.